Imagine waking up tomorrow morning and driving to the gas station near your house. You pull up to the pump, reach for the nozzle, and then notice a handwritten sign taped across the machine. No fuel available. Not because a storm shut down the roads, not because refinery workers went on strike. This is no longer a hypothetical scenario. This is happening in real time. In the last 72 hours, the global order has been shaken to its core. Iranian forces have effectively choked the Strait of Hormuz, the single most critical energy corridor on the planet. Oil tankers that normally move through the channel like clockwork have stopped. Shipping insurance premiums have exploded. Captains are waiting for instructions that may never come. Meanwhile, warships from the United States Navy are physically pushing through hostile waters, escorting massive oil tankers past Iranian patrol boats, drones, and sea mines. This is not routine maritime security. This is an armed convoy system, something the world has not seen on this scale since the tanker wars of the 1980s. Oil prices have detonated almost instantly. Natural gas markets across Europe reacted with panic. In a single trading session, prices surged nearly 50% as traders tried to calculate what would happen if shipments from the Persian Gulf stopped moving entirely. Stock markets from New York to Tokyo began bleeding value. Energy companies surged upward while the transportation, airlines, and manufacturing stocks plunged. And deep inside the Persian Gulf, an astonishing number of vessels are now sitting idle. More than 3,200 ships, tankers, cargo vessels, container carriers are effectively frozen in place, engines running, crews waiting, burning fuel reserves while the world's most important trade artery teeters on the edge of shutdown. But here's the part of this story that almost nobody is talking about yet. The Strait of Hormuz is only half of what happened. Because while the world was watching tankers stop moving, Iran executed something far more dramatic across the Gulf states themselves. And what happened in that 24-hour window may shape the next decade of global power. To understand how we got here, we have to go back several months. Tensions between the United States, Israel, and Iran had been building steadily, almost quietly. American carrier strike groups moved closer to the region. Strategic bombers began operating from bases across the Middle East. Meanwhile, Israel intensified a series of precision strikes targeting Iran's underground nuclear infrastructure. Facilities once believed to be unreachable, buried deep beneath mountains and reinforced with layers of concrete and steel, were suddenly under threat. Iran found itself facing a situation it had not confronted in modern history. Its proxy networks had been weakened. Its air defense systems had suffered significant degradation. And its leadership faced a moment every powerful state eventually confronts. Do you absorb the blow and preserve your long-term strength? Or do you retaliate immediately and risk escalating the conflict into something uncontrollable? Iran chose retaliation, and what came next stunned military analysts around the world. This was not a limited response. It was not a symbolic missile strike designed to demonstrate capability. Iran launched a multi-front assault across the entire Persian Gulf region. Targets appeared across every member of the Gulf Cooperation Council. That includes Saudi Arabia United, Arab Emirates, Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain, Oman. Every single one of them was struck or threatened within the same 24-hour window. For decades, military planners had warned about exactly this scenario. The nightmare situation where Iran decided to overwhelm Gulf defenses with sheer scale, launching attacks across multiple countries simultaneously. These countries are not minor regional players. They sit on top of the largest oil and gas reserves on the planet. Their energy exports fuel factories in Asia, power homes in Europe, and keep global transportation networks running. And suddenly, all of them were under attack. The most dramatic example unfolded over the skies of the United Arab Emirates. The United Arab Emirates absorbed an astonishing wave of incoming weapons. Military sources later estimated the attack included 165 ballistic missiles, 2 cruise missiles, 541 drones. 541 drones entering the airspace of a single country during one coordinated engagement window. For a moment, imagine what that looks like on a radar screen. Hundreds of moving targets appearing almost simultaneously. Air defense operators racing to prioritize threats. Interceptor missiles launching in rapid succession. Systems working at maximum capacity. The UAE's air defense network, one of the most advanced in the Middle East, managed to intercept the majority of them. But not all. Some slipped through. Explosions echoed across the outskirts of major cities. Fragments of intercepted drones fell across residential areas. And even when the defense system succeeded, the psychological impact was enormous, because the message was clear. If Iran chose to escalate further, the region's defensive systems could be overwhelmed. The consequences were immediate, not only militarily, but economically. Financial markets reacted with a speed rarely seen outside major global crises. Energy traders realized something terrifying. If the Persian Gulf becomes an active war zone, 20% of the world's oil supply could be disrupted almost overnight. Think about what that means. 1 out of every 5 barrels of oil consumed globally travels through the Strait of Hormuz. Countries like Japan, India, and much of Europe rely heavily on those shipments. A prolonged disruption would ripple through the entire global economy. Airline ticket prices would rise. Manufacturing costs would increase. Food prices would climb because agriculture depends heavily on fuel and fertilizer. Energy is embedded in nearly every product that moves through the modern economy, which means a disruption here affects almost everyone. And that is why naval forces move so quickly. Warships from the United States Navy began escorting commercial tankers through the Strait of Hormuz. These convoys are designed to protect ships from drones, mines, and fast attack boats. But they also carry enormous strategic risk, because every escort mission places American sailors within direct engagement distance of Iranian forces. One miscalculation, one missile launched too close, one drone misidentified, and the entire situation could escalate into open naval combat. Fuel costs rise. Airlines pay more for jet fuel. Manufacturing costs increase. Food prices climb because agriculture relies heavily on fuel and fertilizer derived from petroleum. Energy is embedded in almost every product humans consume, which means a disruption here affects nearly everyone on the planet. Financial markets reacted immediately. Stock indices dipped. Currencies in energy importing nations weakened. Countries heavily dependent on foreign oil, including India, Japan, Pakistan, and much of Europe, suddenly faced the possibility of a severe energy shock. Some economists began discussing scenarios where oil could climb past $100 per barrel if shipping disruptions continued. And the world economy today is far more fragile than it was during previous oil crises. Debt levels remain high after the pandemic. Central banks are already fighting inflation. A sudden spike in energy costs could push multiple economies towards stagflation. It's a dangerous combination of slow growth and rising prices. In other words, this war is not just a regional conflict. It is a potential global economic crisis. But while missiles were flying and markets were shaking, another major power was watching the situation very carefully. In Moscow, Vladimir Putin faced a strategic dilemma. Russia and Iran had signed a 20-year strategic partnership agreement in early 2025. The two nations had expanded cooperation in trade, energy, and military technology. Iranian drones had been used by Russian forces in Ukraine. Russian engineers had helped construct nuclear reactors inside Iran. Billions of dollars in joint projects were underway. And suddenly, in a single weekend, Iran's leadership had been decapitated and its military infrastructure heavily damaged. Putin publicly condemned the killing of Khamenei. He described it as a violation of international law. He offered condolences to the Iranian government, but he stopped short of threatening military retaliation. And that restraint revealed something important. The Russia-Iran partnership did not include a formal mutual defense clause. Russia was not obligated to defend Iran militarily. And escalating directly against the United States would risk dragging Moscow into a confrontation it could not afford. Instead, the Kremlin adopted a careful strategy. Watch, wait, and benefit from rising oil prices that strengthen Russia's own energy exports. Yet even that strategy carries risks. If regime change eventually occurs in Tehran, a new government could move closer to the West. That would wipe out years of Russian investment and influence in the region, which means Moscow is not truly winning in this crisis. It is simply observing a dangerous gamble unfold. Meanwhile, inside the United States, political debates intensified. Some lawmakers questioned whether the strikes had been properly authorized. Senators demanded intelligence briefings. Discussions about war powers and congressional authority quickly began. And on the battlefield itself, the situation continued escalating. Thousands of casualties were reported across Iran. Military infrastructure was being destroyed daily. Iranian forces launched additional attacks on American bases. Naval clashes intensified in the Persian Gulf. The risk of accidental strikes near nuclear facilities began to alarm international monitoring organizations. Each passing day brought the conflict closer to a scenario that experts had feared for years, a regional war colliding with sensitive nuclear infrastructure. So where does this end? Right now? Nobody knows. Diplomats are scrambling. The United Nations Security Council has held emergency meetings. Regional governments are urging restraint, and thousands of foreign nationals are evacuating the Middle East as governments warn their citizens to leave immediately. All of this began with one pre-dawn strike. Within 5 days, it had expanded into a regional crisis involving multiple countries, frozen energy markets, and triggered military confrontations across land, air, and sea. The Strait of Hormuz, the narrow passage that carries a fifth of the world's oil, remains under constant threat. And the decisions made in the coming days by leaders in Washington, Tehran, and Moscow could determine whether this war remains regional or becomes something far larger. The world has already changed this week. The only question now is how much further it will change before anyone decides to stop. Meanwhile, another extraordinary signal appeared in the shipping markets. The freight rate for very large crude carriers, known as VLCCs, the enormous supertankers that move oil across oceans, exploded to record levels. The daily charter rate surged to $400 $23,730 per day for a single ship. That represented a 94% increase in just one trading session. To energy economists, this was a signal that the entire logistics system behind global oil trade had suddenly become unstable. When transportation costs rise that dramatically, every barrel of oil becomes more expensive to deliver, and eventually those costs reach ordinary consumers. In the United States, the effects began appearing quickly. Fuel prices started creeping upward at gas stations within 48 hours. Airline stocks dropped as investors anticipated higher jet fuel costs. Logistics companies warned that transport expenses could spike dramatically if shipping routes remained disrupted. In other words, the conflict in the Persian Gulf was no longer just a geopolitical story. It was becoming an economic shock that would reach consumers everywhere. But perhaps the most symbolically powerful moment of the crisis came next. An Iranian drone struck near the United States Embassy in Riyadh. The embassy compound had already been evacuated hours earlier as tensions escalated, and fortunately the facility was not operating when the drone impacted nearby. Still, the symbolism was unmistakable. A drone bearing Iranian markings striking American diplomatic territory in the capital of Saudi Arabia. Within hours, the United States ordered the closure of its embassies in both Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. Security warnings spread across the region, and then financial markets reacted again. The Dow Jones Industrial Average plunged more than 1,000 points in a single trading session, its worst performance since the previous spring. Technology companies dropped sharply as investors fled riskier assets. Energy companies initially surged before experiencing wild volatility. Defense contractors rallied as governments signaled potential military escalation. And perhaps most telling of all, investors rushed toward one traditional safe haven: gold. The metal that markets turn to when fear dominates global finance surged rapidly in price. Because when geopolitical crises escalate to this level, gold often becomes the simplest signal of what investors truly believe. And at that moment, the signal was clear. The world was entering a period of deep uncertainty, and the decisions made in the coming days by Washington, Tehran, and the governments across the Gulf would determine whether this crisis stabilized or became the beginning of a much larger global economic shock. This is the point where most news coverage fades out. The explosions, the missile counts, the dramatic satellite images, those are the parts that dominate headlines. But the reality of global crises is that the most important moment comes after the explosions stop dominating the screen. What matters now is what happens next. And that is a question being debated behind closed doors by three very different groups of leaders: government leaders in the Gulf, military commanders in Washington, and strategic planners in Tehran. Each group is facing decisions that could shape the next decade of global politics. The Gulf states face a historic choice. The countries of the Gulf Cooperation Council are standing at a crossroads unlike any moment in their modern history. Their territory was struck. Their cities experienced air raid alerts. Critical infrastructure, airports, energy facilities, and military sites were targeted across multiple nations simultaneously. For countries like United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Kuwait, this was not a distant geopolitical event. It was war arriving in their own airspace. Now their leaders face a decision that carries enormous consequences. If they retaliate directly against Iran, they risk transforming a regional confrontation into a full-scale interstate war across the Persian Gulf. But if they choose not to respond militarily, they risk sending a message that attacks on Gulf territory can occur without consequence. For governments that rely heavily on deterrence and stability to protect their energy infrastructure and global financial hubs, that perception could be dangerous. Defense analysts following the situation have been unusually blunt. If further Iranian attacks occur, the country most likely to respond first may be the United Arab Emirates. Over the past 2 decades, the UAE has quietly built one of the most technologically advanced and professional armed forces in the Arab world. Its military has gained operational experience in conflicts in Yemen and counter-terror operations abroad. It possesses modern air power, advanced missile defense systems, and close strategic ties with Western militaries. Just as important, the leadership in Abu Dhabi has consistently demonstrated a willingness to act decisively when it believes national security or regional credibility is at stake. In other words, the Emirates is not a state that easily absorbs humiliation without response. Saudi Arabia is calculating a different strategy. Meanwhile, the leadership in Riyadh is working through a more complicated calculation. In recent years, Saudi Arabia had been carefully attempting to reshape its relationship with Iran. Diplomatic channels had reopened. Regional tensions had been reduced. The Saudi leadership hoped that lowering confrontation would protect its most vulnerable strategic asset, its massive oil infrastructure. That strategy was designed to avoid precisely the kind of escalation that is now unfolding. The missile and drone attacks across the Gulf have placed that diplomatic strategy under its most severe test. The question now circulating inside Saudi leadership circles is simple but profound. Can diplomacy survive this level of direct attack? Or has the kingdom been pushed into a position where military retaliation becomes unavoidable? Saudi Arabia's response will likely determine whether the Gulf remains a contained crisis or becomes the epicenter of a much wider conflict. Iran may have miscalculated the political impact. At the same time, Tehran may now be confronting a strategic outcome that its planners did not fully anticipate. 3 senior Arab diplomats, speaking anonymously to international journalists, used language that was unusually direct in describing the situation. They characterized the Iranian strikes as unprovoked and unjustified. They emphasized that Gulf states had repeatedly communicated that their airspace would not be used as staging grounds for attacks against Iran. And they warned that by striking every Gulf country simultaneously, Tehran may have triggered a reaction very different from what it intended. For decades, analysts believed the greatest vulnerability among Gulf states was fragmentation. Different political systems, different alliances, different threat perceptions. Iran's doctrine of multi-front deterrence attempted to exploit that fragmentation, striking multiple adversaries simultaneously to create fear and hesitation. But the attacks may have had the opposite effect. Instead of dividing the Gulf states, they may have unified them. A crisis that once produced competing responses may now produce a coordinated one. Sometimes, the most dangerous moment in geopolitics is when an adversary unintentionally strengthens the coalition against it. The United States Navy is now in the middle of the crisis. While regional governments debate their next move, another force is already operating in the most dangerous environment of the conflict: the United States Navy. American warships are currently escorting commercial tankers through the waters of the Persian Gulf and toward the Strait of Hormuz. These escort missions are not symbolic. They are real operational deployments taking place under conditions of active hostility. Destroyers and cruisers equipped with advanced radar and missile systems are physically accompanying oil tankers through waters where Iranian fast attack boats, drone swarms, and potential naval mines are present. Every escort mission represents a calculated risk. A single miscalculation, a missile launch, a mine detonation, or a collision at sea could trigger an immediate military escalation. The last time American naval forces faced conditions this tense in the Gulf was during the tanker war in the final years of the Iran-Iraq War. That period saw dozens of ships attacked, several destroyed, and multiple incidents that nearly escalated into direct U.S.-Iran confrontation. History rarely repeats exactly, but sometimes the patterns are eerily familiar. Why the Strait of Hormuz matters more than anything else. To understand the stakes of the current crisis, you have to understand the numbers behind the Strait of Hormuz. Every single day, between 20 and 21 million barrels of oil move through this narrow waterway. That is roughly 1/5 of the entire global petroleum supply. And all of it passes through a maritime corridor only about 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. There is no realistic alternative route that can absorb that volume of energy. Pipelines exist, but their capacity is limited. Strategic reserves exist, but they are designed for temporary disruptions, not sustained closures. If the Strait of Hormuz were effectively blocked for even 30 days, the economic consequences would ripple across the entire planet. Fuel prices would surge, shipping costs would rise dramatically, manufacturing expenses would climb as energy prices increase. Food prices would rise because agriculture depends heavily on fuel, fertilizers, and transport. In other words, the impact would not be limited to oil markets. It would reach every product that is manufactured, transported, or grown anywhere in the world. And that is why the decisions being made right now, in Washington, in Tehran, and across the Gulf, may determine not only the future of the Middle East, but the stability of the global economy itself. We are not at that point yet. Despite the rising tension, despite the headlines flashing across global news networks, despite the sudden surge in oil prices, and the nervous calculations happening inside trading floors from New York to Singapore, the reality is that the world has not yet crossed the line into full-scale conflict. American naval power still hangs over the region like a shadow. For decades, the United States Navy has maintained a constant presence in the Persian Gulf. Aircraft carriers, guided missile destroyers, surveillance aircraft, submarines operating silently beneath the waves, an entire network of military capability designed for one purpose: keeping the Strait of Hormuz open. Because the Strait of Hormuz is not just another shipping route. It is the single most important energy artery on the planet. Every single day, roughly 1/5 of the world's oil supply moves through that narrow passage of water. Tankers loaded with crude from Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates, and other producers pass through it in an almost continuous procession. Each one represents millions of barrels of energy. Each one represents billions of dollars in economic activity waiting to power factories, fuel aircraft, heat homes, and keep entire economies alive. which is why the idea of closing the strait has always been considered one of the most dangerous geopolitical scenarios imaginable. And Iran understands that better than anyone. Inside Tehran, the leadership knows exactly what would happen if they attempted a complete formal closure of the waterway. It would not remain a regional issue for long. It would not be handled quietly through diplomacy. It would almost certainly trigger a direct and overwhelming military response, not just from the United States, but from a coalition of countries whose economies depend on the uninterrupted flow of energy through that narrow corridor. The Iranian leadership has spent decades carefully balancing pressure and restraint. They push the boundaries, they test the limits, they send signals, but they also understand the consequences of going too far. And that is why, despite all the chaos of the past 72 hours, the Strait of Hormuz has not been officially declared closed. There has been no announcement, no formal blockade, no fleet positioned across the channel with missiles locked onto passing ships. Because Iran knows that such a move would cross a line that might threaten the survival of the regime itself. The government in Tehran may be willing to take risks, but it is not suicidal. And yet something extraordinary has just happened. Something that military analysts, energy economists, and national security planners are only now beginning to fully understand. Because even though the strait has not been officially closed, its flow has already been disrupted. Not by a massive naval battle, not by mines stretching across the shipping lanes, not by warships firing missiles across the horizon. Instead, the disruption came from something far smaller, far cheaper, and far more difficult to control. Drones. Small, relatively inexpensive unmanned aerial vehicles, the kind that can be built in workshops, launched from hidden coastal locations, or deployed from vessels that disappear into the endless traffic of the Gulf. Over the past several years, drone technology has spread across the world at astonishing speed. What once required billion-dollar defense programs can now be assembled with commercial components, modified software, and a few engineers who understand the technology. And that reality has quietly transformed the nature of modern conflict. In the past, closing a strategic waterway like the Strait of Hormuz would have required a massive military operation, warships, aircraft, mine-laying vessels, entire fleets positioned in visible, unmistakable formations. It would have been an act of open war. But the events of these 72 hours revealed something else entirely. Iran did not close the Strait of Hormuz with a fleet. It closed it with uncertainty. It closed it with risk. It closed it with fear. Reports began to circulate of drone activity near shipping routes. Tankers detected unidentified aircraft approaching their positions. Surveillance systems picked up signals that suggested the possibility of attacks. Some ships turned back. Others slowed their transit through the region. But the most powerful reaction did not come from the ships themselves. It came from the insurance companies. Because every tanker that passes through the Strait of Hormuz carries insurance coverage worth hundreds of millions of dollars. That coverage is what allows the cargo to move. It is what protects the owners, the operators, the investors, and the banks financing the shipments. And insurance companies operate on one principle above all else: risk. When risk becomes too high, coverage disappears. Within hours of the first credible drone threats emerging, insurance providers began reassessing the security situation in the region. Premiums skyrocketed. Then came the cancellations. Suddenly, shipping companies found themselves facing an impossible calculation. Continue sailing through the strait without adequate insurance protection, risking catastrophic financial losses if a vessel were damaged or destroyed, or halt operations entirely. For many companies, the answer was immediate. They stopped. Tankers remained in ports. Routes were delayed, and the flow of energy through one of the most important waterways on Earth began to slow, not because the ships were physically blocked, but because the financial system behind them had frozen. That is the revelation at the center of this entire crisis. The realization that the world's energy supply chain, a system that moves trillions of dollars in resources every year, can be disrupted without firing a single missile, without deploying a single warship, without formally declaring war. All it takes is a credible threat, a handful of drones. Economists modeled the impact of blockades. Energy analysts calculated how long reserves could last if the route were completely cut off. But those models were built around traditional warfare. Large forces, clear confrontations, predictable escalation. What just happened does not follow those rules. The disruption did not come from overwhelming military power. It came from asymmetry, cheap technology deployed in ways that exploit the weaknesses of a globalized system. And once that vulnerability has been revealed, it cannot be unseen. Because Iran is not the only actor capable of using drones near a major shipping lane. Dozens of countries now possess the technology, and beyond them, non-state groups have also demonstrated increasing access to unmanned systems. Groups that operate outside traditional deterrence, groups that may not fear economic sanctions or diplomatic consequences, groups that understand the leverage created by threatening the flow of energy. The vulnerability is not only in the military balance, the vulnerability is in the insurance market, it is in the risk assessments made by shipping executives, it is in the complex web of financial guarantees that allows global trade to function, and it is in the fragile design of an economic system that was never built to absorb shocks at this speed. Energy markets react in minutes, insurance decisions happen in hours, shipping disruptions ripple across supply chains in days, and the economic consequences spread across continents within weeks. The world just witnessed how quickly that cascade can begin. But the most important part of this story is what comes next. Because once a vulnerability becomes visible, the race begins. Governments will attempt to adapt. Navies will study new methods of protecting shipping lanes from drone threats. Energy companies will reconsider the geographic concentration of their supply routes. Investors will reevaluate the risks embedded in global energy infrastructure. And somewhere inside military planning rooms around the world, analysts are already updating their models. They are asking new questions. Questions that did not seem urgent just a few days ago. How many drones would it take to create a sustained disruption in a major shipping corridor? How quickly could such a strategy be deployed? And how difficult would it be to stop? The answers to those questions may shape the future of global energy security. Because the world has just learned something it cannot unlearn. The rules have changed. Not slowly, not gradually, but suddenly. In a matter of hours. And the governments, the investors, the energy companies, and the military planners who understand the implications first will be the ones who shape what comes next. That is where we are now, standing at the edge of a new strategic reality. What these 72 hours have produced is not just another regional confrontation in the Middle East. It is not just a temporary crisis that will fade once diplomatic negotiations resume. It is something deeper, a shift, a revelation about how the world's most critical waterway can be held hostage without a traditional blockade. Without fleets, without declarations of war, just technology, strategy, and the knowledge that fear can move markets faster than missiles ever could. And that realization may turn out to be the most powerful weapon revealed in this entire crisis. Because once the world understands how fragile its energy lifelines really are, everything changes